The 18th of April, 1976. Prime Minister and Mrs. Robert David Muldoon of New Zealand arrive in Seoul at the invitation of the government of the Republic of Korea. Following his first visit to Korea in 1970 as Secretary of Finance, Premier Muldoon arrives at Gimpo International Airport for the second time and is warmly greeted by Prime Minister and Mrs. Chae Kyu-ha and other high-ranking officials of Korea. In his welcoming address, Prime Minister Chae says that he wishes to see closer bilateral relations in political, economic and cultural fields between the two countries. Premier Muldoon says in his arrival statement that he admires Korea for its astonishing economic development, which has taken place notwithstanding the ever-present threat from North Korea. After receiving bouquets of flowers from Seoul citizens, the visiting New Zealand Premier exchanges greetings with administrative, legislative and judiciary leaders of Korea and members of the Foreign Diplomatic Corps in Seoul. New Zealand, one of the 16 Allied countries during the Korean War in the early 1950s, had dispatched fighting units of the Army and Navy to Korea to defend freedom and justice, and has always been actively supporting joint proposals by the Western countries at the United Nations. After the welcoming ceremony at the airport, Premier Muldoon and Premier Chae head for the heart of Seoul. Citizens turned out on either side of the street with flags of both countries to welcome the visiting Premier. Prime Minister and Mrs. Muldoon spend the first night in Seoul, a city free from traces of the Korean War. A cordial, welcoming mood prevails over the streets of Seoul. On the second day of his visit to Korea, Premier and Mrs. Muldoon visit a villa called Sangyongjang, with rich traditional flavor of Korea. After a long trip, they find a moment of relaxation in the well-kept, beautiful garden. evening, Premier and Mrs. Muldoon attend a dinner party hosted in their honor by Premier Che Kyu-ha at Yongbin-gwan. At the dinner party, Premier Che states that the forces of communism is expanding both on the Indochina Peninsula and in Africa, and Communist North Korea is threatening the peace with their ever-present intention of communizing the Korean Peninsula through armed invasion. Premier Muldoon declares that peace on the Korean Peninsula should be maintained at any cost. On the third day, under drizzling rain, Premier and Mrs. Muldoon visit the National Cemetery in Seoul. The visiting Premier places a wreath before the memorial to unknown soldiers who sacrificed their lives for the cause of peace and freedom during the Korean War. Then they pay homage to the late First Lady of Korea, Madame Yuk Yong-soo. The visiting Premier then calls on Premier Che Kyu-ha at the Capitol building. The two Premiers discuss measures on economic and technical cooperation, ways of expanding trade volume between Korea and New Zealand, and the problem of New Zealand's continuing backing of the Korean stance at the International Forum. The ties between the two countries are reaffirmed as Premier Muldoon and Korea's Foreign Minister Park Tong-jin sign an agreement on trade, economic and technical cooperation. Prime Minister Muldoon now visits Speaker Chung Il-kwon at the National Assembly. In his talk with the visiting Prime Minister, Speaker Chung explains that North Korea refused to accept, after South-North dialogues were initiated, a non-aggression pact proposed by President Park Chung-hee and a proposal of the Korean National Red Cross on finding the whereabouts of the separated families. On the afternoon of the same day, Premier Muldoon and his party visit President Park Chung-hee at Cheongwa-dae. At the Cheongwa-dae porch, President Park and his daughter, Kun Hei, receive Premier and Mrs. Muldoon warmly. Prime Minister Muldoon signs his name in the visitors' book. Then President Park and his daughter Kun Hei, who performs the role of First Lady, talk with Premier and Mrs. Muldoon in an amicable atmosphere. Premier Muldoon now introduces to President Park members of his official suite. In their first exclusive summit talks, President Park Chung-hee and Premier Robert D. Muldoon reach agreement on further strengthening the bilateral relations in economic and technical cooperation, reconfirming the traditional friendship existing between the two countries. While the summit talks go on, Miss Park shares a friendly conversation with Mrs. Muldoon. In the evening, Premier and Mrs. Muldoon and members of the entourage attend a banquet given by President Park at the capital. At the dinner party, the President says that the peace on the Korean Peninsula is directly linked with peace in Asia and the world, and emphasizes that Korea will adopt an open policy to all non-hostile countries, and this peace policy of Korea and the efforts being directed to attaining prosperity can effectively bear fruit only when there are close ties and cooperation between friendly countries. Premier Muldoon states in reply that he supports the aspiration of the Korean government, the aspiration that the Korean people must be reunified based on peace and freedom, and will continue to strive to help attain such a goal through close cooperation with Korea and other friendly countries. Following the dinner, the leaders of both countries watch colorful folk art performances. This is Su Jae-chun, a traditional court music which eulogizes peace and prosperity of the nation. dance of the floral crown. In ancient times, women with floral crowns on their heads danced this piece at royal banquets. The fan dance. Members of the National Children's Chorus sing a folk song of New Zealand. And the Korean folk song, Arirang.
Arirang conclude the Korean folk performance presented in honor of the Right Honorable Robert David Malden, Prime Minister of New Zealand, and Mrs. Malden. Thank you very much.
After the performances are over, Premier and Mrs. Muldoon shake hands with the children. On the fourth day of his visit to Korea, Prime Minister Muldoon inspects a forward area near the demilitarized zone via helicopter. Guided by General Lee Se-ho, Army Chief of Staff, Prime Minister Muldoon eyewitnesses the tragedies of a divided country through a telescope which shows vividly North Korean pillboxes and bunkers that North Korea built illegally in the demilitarized zone. The visiting New Zealand Prime Minister now heads towards Pyeongtaek to visit the Korea-New Zealand demonstration dairy farm, looking down on green hills and well-developed communities from aboard a helicopter. Upon arrival at the pasture, New Zealanders residing in Korea greet him and share moments of joy with him. There are 294 heads of dairy cows grazing in the pasture, developed in June 1969 in accordance with an agreement between Korea and New Zealand, and some 2,500 kilograms of milk are produced here daily. Meanwhile, Mrs. Muldoon visits Songyong textile plant in Suwon, an historic city located some 40 kilometers south of Seoul. During her visit to the polyester yarn manufacturing plant, the First Lady of New Zealand shows a particular interest in the dyeing process of man-made yarn and blended fabrics. On the afternoon of the 21st of April, Premier Muldoon drives along the scenic Han River to visit Seoul National University, the nation's largest educational institution. At the university, he receives an honorary doctorate of philosophy. In a press interview, Premier Muldoon says that we have no intention of having any close relations with North Korea until it has demonstrated willingness to enter into a meaningful dialogue for the de-escalation of tension. He further says that he will convey to Communist China President Park's message that the Republic of Korea has no aggressive intentions, although it will vigorously resist any aggression from the North. At the Chosun Hotel, Prime Minister Muldoon hosts a dinner for Korean leaders and members of the Foreign Diplomatic Corps in Seoul. On the 5th day of his visit to Korea, Premier and Mrs. Muldoon visit President Park Chung-hee to bid farewell. Here the two leaders reaffirm their recognition of the importance of stability on the Korean peninsula to the peace and security of the Asian and Pacific region. Premier Muldoon expresses his appreciation to the government and the people of Korea for their warm and friendly welcome accorded to him, extends a cordial invitation to President Park to visit New Zealand again, and President Park accepts it with pleasure. The two leaders then bid farewell to each other. Premier and Mrs. Muldoon attend a brief farewell ceremony at Kimpo International Airport. After exchange of greetings with Prime Minister and Mrs. Chae Kyu-ha and domestic and foreign dignitaries, Prime Minister and Mrs. Robert D. Muldoon and his party leave Korea.